W.L. Ross and Chairman and Company Chairman and the Trump Campaign Economic Advisor, Wilbur Ross. Wilbur, good to see you.
Good to see you,
Thank you so much for joining us. So what is Trump's plan regarding infrastructure? This is an issue that Dagan has brought up a lot because when you look at these plans, it's all about more spending.
Well, it is about more spending. Infrastructure is spending. But the question is, how do you finance it? Trump's plan is to do it in the private sector with tax credits for the equity. So we are assuming that 1/6 of the capital would have to be put up by equity, 5-to-1 leverage from private sector lenders. To encourage that much equity coming in, we would give them an 82% tax credit. This would have several consequences. One, it lowers the total amount that has to be financed because you don't need to finance the tax credit part. Two, the equity part is the most expensive one to do, so it has a double whammy. It probably reduces the cost of the project 18 to 20% and makes a lot of capital available. We think over the next 10 years you could generate $1 trillion worth of capital from this program.
It is a job creator, Dagan.
But Wilbur, it's still government borrowing. It's still the government borrowing.
No, it isn't, because
why isn't it? If the government's spending the money, who's doing the borrowing then? Who's the borrower?
The borrower would be private sector by having put up the large 16.7% amount of equity. And the way the tax credits would be repaid, infrastructure is a very labor-intensive activity. Around 44% of the cost of infrastructure is labor. Taxing that income at 28% gives you most of the money back from the tax credit. You get the rest of the money back out of the corporate profits from the contractor, charging them the 15% that's in the Trump tax bill. So it's totally revenue neutral.
Have you looked at the amount of jobs? We're talking about the labor that you just mentioned. It's pretty significant. Has there been an indication of the amount of jobs created and what it would look like for the economy?
It would be huge because each percentage point in GDP is around 1 million+ jobs. And if you did 100 and some odd billion a year, 180 billion would be exactly 1% of GDP. So that would be 1 million or so jobs.
Okay.
So
the important thing about it is, since manufacturing has been in such a big decline, this is the kind of job that people with limited education could get and yet make a decent pay.
On a very simple level, though, when you talk about spending, normally conservatives talking about cutting spending, and when you hear about this kind of spending, a fiscal conservative like me, it's just the words like that are turnoffs. And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way.
Listen more carefully, because it's not.
I'm just talking about the way that it sounds when you talk about it.
Maybe, but it's revenue neutral to the federal government.
This is important because this is where the debate comes in. Okay, so you do believe this is revenue neutral?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. How does it compare to her plan, though? So this is revenue neutral. It's going to employ a lot of people. So in comparison to her plan, what does that look like?
She needs to raise taxes in order to
her plan. Hillary's plan is to raise $275 billion more corporate tax, more business tax.
Ugh, job killer.
That's a job killer for sure. And then of the 275, she wants government directly to lend 250. Well, guess who are going to be the borrowers under that administration?
Let me ask you this, though. We haven't raised the national gas tax since the mid-'90s.
Right.
So it's been more than 20 years. Why aren't the people using the roads paying for their repair?
Well, that's a whole different question.
Yeah, it's a different question.
It's also a regressive tax. That's a regressive tax because that hurts the poorest the most.
I know. That's the reason the Democrats won't raise it, and Republicans aren't in favor of raising any taxes for the most part. But that's a central issue, that the gas tax, because we're getting more miles from the cars that we're driving on the road, it's a declining source of revenue in particular, and then we haven't raised it at all.
Yeah, but this is intended to take care of other kinds of infrastructure problems. You've got water systems that are failing. There are 65 billion gallons a day that get through leaky water pipes and dissipated.
Wow.
That's enough to take the top 10 cities for a couple of weeks. You have safety problems with bridges. You've got all kinds of things that need to be financed.
So while he wants to spend or have a revenue neutral plan on infrastructure, build up. He's also wanting to roll back regulations as part of his economic plan. So Donald Trump yesterday called for a 21st century version of the 1933 Glass-Steagall law that required the separation of commercial and investment banking. Talk to us about this, because we all know what Dodd-Frank has done to the financial services sector, and lending has become tougher. That's been one of the issues for this economy. Tell me about this 21st century version of Glass-Steagall.
Well, our feeling is that banks, it isn't so much that they're too big, it's that they're too complex.
Too connected.
Too connected and too complex internally. I mean, think about what you have to know to run a big bank. You've got to have every geography in the world, every kind of obscure, complicated product in the world, in the derivative markets. That's an awful big menu for anybody to absorb. We think it might be better for the banks to stick to lending and to, instead of making more restrictions on lending, make it easier for them to make loans. Think about it. When you're suing banks every day for the loans that they made before, it's not the way to encourage them to make new loans. They're making banks gun-shy.
Are you saying there should be more of a separation?
I think the more important thing is sensible regulation rather than just regulation for the sake of regulation. When you think about it, with all the fines over subprime lending, can you name a single person who has ever dispossessed from a house that didn't actually have a mortgage, wasn't delinquent on it, and deserved to be foreclosed? There was one case where that's been proven. So it's punitive regulation, it's punitive law enforcement, rather than anything very sensible.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons small business is all in for Donald Trump, because they're getting killed by regulations.
Absolutely.
We know that. Wilbur, good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be watching the developments. Wilbur Ross there coming up.